Hello, I'm Joe Lenton. Welcome to Original Art Photography. Today I'd like to share with you a few things that I do when I'm processing landscape photos sometimes. I like to use vignettes to draw the eye into the image, and sometimes those vignettes are not necessarily in the middle. And if you're developing in Lightroom, you'll know that if you use the vignette facility in there, you'll see that it just comes from the edges to the middle. Yes, you can adjust it a little bit, but it's always going to be wanting to go towards the middle. So if your point of interest is not smack bang in the middle, then that doesn't necessarily work very well. I also like to stack up adjustments to make it a little bit more of a smooth blend rather than going quite so dark as you tend to get with the vignette tool over here. So with this image here, I'm just going to talk you through a few adjustments that I might make to it. This was taken shortly before it rained when I was in a forest in Norfolk recently. And there was a lot of sort of contrast in the light there, which at the moment you can see doesn't come out all that brilliantly in the photo. So I'm just going to talk you through a few different steps that I might use to improve something like this with. First things first, I think I'll just change the verticals a little bit. I want our trees to be a bit straighter. They all look like they're falling over at the moment, so we'll just use the transform tool to do that manually. Then I think I'll change the crop. And where the lines are all converging from the tree lines, from the path coming in here, all these lines are converging in this point next to this tree here. So that's the point I'm going to make my main point of interest. So that's really where I'm going to have my bottom left hand third, and then sort of the bottom third of the image is the land with the trees and the sky above it. I do tend to like to go for letterbox crop, so I will just try this as a 2x1 crop. Let's have a look. Yeah, and that's quite nice, so I think I'll leave it like that for now. Now then, over the left here you can see we've got some very heavy shadows, and there's also some quite dark shadows here and a few patches over to the right there. So we need to bring them up a little bit, otherwise they will be going very, very dark. So you can use the shadows slider and a little bit on the blacks just to bring that up. To get a bit back in the sky, just bring the highlights down a little bit. Obviously this has the effect of making the image look rather flat, so we are going to need to introduce some contrast back into it, but as we're going to be putting quite a bit of contrast in, there's no harm in just taking out in that way so that we can control how we put it in later. Now with the clarity we can then bring a little bit of the micro level contrast back in, a little bit of sharpness to the image as well. We'll leave that just there for now. Now I'm going to use the Radial Filter. This enables you to place anywhere within the image to get a sort of a vignette type of effect. You can choose where your center of interest is going to be. So as we say, this is where everything converges, so I'm going to have that as my main center of interest. Reset the effect that it has by double clicking on an effect there, and now I can drag the exposure down a little bit. Now you see obviously I could just take it down quite heavily, but I want to build this up in a few layers, so I don't want to do too much at once. So we're going for round about minus 0.3 and then adding in a little bit of contrast. Now of course if you haven't used the Radial tool before, then you might want to know that you can change the feather of the effect using the slider here, and you can see how much that increases the softness of the transition, and you can invert it so you can create a spotlight sort of an effect as well if you really want to. So that would be my first one that I'd just put in like that. Then we would do the same sort of thing again. This time we're going to go a bit wider, so we'll have that about there. Again, just going to reset the effect, drop the exposure down just a little, bit more up on the contrast again, and then we'll go with one more sort of wider one. Again, just similar sort of thing, drop that exposure down just a little, contrast up just a small amount. Okay, there we go. Now you'll see we've started to lose some of the detail again around the edges here where that's nearly gone to black, so you might just have to play with your shadows and black sliders a bit just to get rid of the clipping warning that we had up there. That had gone blue, which meant that some of that in here was going to pure black. So as you can see, just by lifting that up, that's got rid of the clipping warning that we would have had up here. Given a little bit more detail back in there, but still kept it pretty dark. Now, what we've done so far then, we've come from that to that. So little bit of a change, starting to show a little bit more contrast in the image. Hopefully the composition's a little bit clearer. I know it's not the world's most fantastic autumn image, but it's quite a good one for showing you this effect with the vignetting, because it is like it's all drawing you down this path towards the end there. I might choose to ensure that there's a little bit more of an obvious highlight at the end there by creating one more radial filter in here near the end like that, and keeping that quite small so it just affects just that little area in there. Again, reset the effect, drop the exposure just a touch, and there we go. So you can see that's the lightest area of the image, with the sort of light from the bottom part of the sky where the cloud is thinner, just giving us that, and then it gradually fades out and gives us a slightly sort of smoother overall vignette sort of effect. If you wanted to increase the autumnal colours a little bit, then you can play around with the white balance. You could just pop up your vibrance a little bit to bring those colours up a touch. But if you wanted to play on it being a little bit more autumnal, a bit more of an orangey feel, you just warm up the white balance a little bit. And it is very easy to overdo that. You don't want to go that far, but a little bit of a tweak, and that can sometimes improve it just a touch. All right. So that's just warmed it up a little bit. Now I want to do a little bit more to just draw in this front leading line down this path at the bottom here to draw the viewer in. So for this I'm going to use a graduated filter. Again, turn the effect off. For this I'm going to bung a little bit of contrast on it for now, just so I can see what we're doing with it, and we'll drag that in like so. Right, so if we take a little bit of clarity there and a little bit of the contrast, then again we can just change that foreground ever so slightly. Now I may not want to darken this bit down on the outside here, so if you click on where it says brush over there, and you can show the overlay so you can see the areas that are affected by it, you could choose to mask out some of this area, so for example, so that it is not darkened any further. Sorry, erase would be better, wouldn't it, not adding more? So switch that to erase, auto mask off, and then we can just brush away some of that area so it doesn't get affected. And again, you can fade that in by using slightly lower flow. Then you have to go over it a few times in some areas, but you can make a smoother transition around those edges. I'm going to whack it back up again for this bit because I don't like that there. Alright, okay, that'll do. There, so again we've just affected this foreground area down here, not wanting to darken that area any further because obviously that's already very dark. So if we just go back to before we added that filter in, that was before and that's after. So again, it's just increasing that pull towards the center area there and giving us a little bit more detail and grit in the foreground. So that's where we've taken that to with just a few adjustments. So that was the original image, and then we cropped it down to a 2:1, and then we started adding in these various different radial filters. So for example, we had the first one that came in, and then where's the next one? There we go, and you can see that bringing in that sort of vignette effect from the edges as well, and a little bit further, plus the scene's been warmed up a little bit, and then we added in our graduated filter on the front, and there we go. So this area in the bottom left third is now brighter a little bit than everything else, And because the light on the day was coming, as you can see, sort of from around the horizon there, no cloud here but thinner cloud here, so that doesn't look too sort of unnatural there. I mean, you can play around with it in more detail and dodge and burn selective areas, but that's just quite an effective technique of using the idea of a vignette, but without it always having to be for something that's in the middle, and for doing it in a slightly more graduated way rather than just having sort of thick black edges and very little in the middle. So simply overlaying a few radial filters and adding a little graduated filter on the bottom there, we could create quite an interesting little effect with that. Just to finish it off, you might want to check on your sharpening a little bit. Zoom in there and you can see you can sharpen up some of those details a bit. Good idea to mask out things like the sky when you're doing the sharpening. So you hold down the Alt or Option key and drag the masking slider there until you can see the areas in white are the only ones you want affected. Then that's fine. Always bung in a tiny bit of noise reduction just in case you've got any grit in there, but at this sort of at low ISOs you wouldn't need it. As you can see, I was at ISO 800, which is why I put a little bit in there. You could then go to a plugin, do a little bit more work with it, or you can just leave it like that. So it's an autumnal sort of scene with plenty of contrast in it due to the light there was at the time, and then that little bit of extra processing that's just brought that contrast out a little bit more. So I hope you find that useful and you're able to try that with some of your own images, and thank you for watching. I'm Joe Lenton and this is Original Art Photography.